Hello, Jennifer Byrne here, and welcome to the vodcast for ABC TV's First Tuesday Book Club, the show for people who are passionate about books and reading. For other vodcasts like this, go to abc.net.au/TV/video, and don't forget to watch the show on ABC TV. Enjoy. Hello, I'm Jennifer Byrne, and thanks for joining me as we explore the very best and worst of literary worlds, utopias and dystopias, those visions of a future in which we will either make it as a species or go the way of the dodo. Whether it's the big government tyranny of 1984, the genetic meddling of Brave New World, Bradbury's fireman in Fahrenheit 451, the temperature at which books burn, or William Morris's Pastoral Paradise. These books ask the big questions, even if we don't always want to know the answers, because in the process, they expose our angst and ambitions, our dreams and our dreads. Let's meet tonight's stout-hearted panel. Max Barry used to work for a big computing firm, but he escaped to write Company, Syrup and Jennifer Government, a book which sees us rich and tax-free in a world run by corporations. Thank you for coming in, Max. John Marsden is a best-selling author and educator. His famous Tomorrow series envisages the invasion and occupation of our country. More later. Author and essayist Emily Maguire is perhaps best known for her work on sex and religion. Also, she harbours a dark penchant for dystopian literature. And finally, Richard Neville. He analyses, talks and writes about subjects ranging from infotech to globalisation. In short, he's a man who daily stares the future in the face and refuses to blink. Welcome them all to the show, won't you? Now, let's start with a moment of clarity in this murky world of dystopias and utopias, because after all, one person's paradise is another person's hell. And we have that in 1516, I think, isn't it? When Thomas More, later St Thomas, wrote his novel Utopia.
Yes, thus coining the term, which was a kind of punning in Greek, meaning no place and good place at the same time. And it was a fantastic new direction. There'd been a sort of utopian impulse, although it wasn't called that, but it was so often at his time either looking back to Paradise Lost, to the Garden of Eden, or it was sort of a millennialist impulse to the belief that Christ will come back to earth for 1,000 years' reign before Judgment Day. So what Thomas More created was a perfected society that was perfected through human effort and through human reason and right here on Earth.
Let's jump through to the sort of late 1800s, because then there was this sort of big surge again of utopias. There was that, in the US, there was that book, Looking Backwards, by Edward Bellamy, which envisages the Marxist utopia. And then there was News from Nowhere in England, which was... I mean, I actually think of it a bit like Wind in the Willows for humans. They went up the riverside and it was all so happy.
I guess it reminds me of Nimbin on the Thames. You know, it was a total kind of ecotopia fantasy, and where no one worked, everyone was happy, there was no industrialisation, there was no class really, and the only thing he was really interested in as being produced by humans was gorgeous sort of furniture, you know, and wallpaper, which of course what William Morris loved that. But it's, on the other hand, there were so many dystopias that it's lovely to find somebody who at least rattled off this kind of almost stoned fantasy of an idealistic place. And the thing is, he fell in love with it himself.
Yes,
the author loved his own creation. I
mean, Morris really believed, didn't he? He thought that if man could go back to this state of innocence and agrarian calm, the world would be happy.
Yes, that yearning in the human spirit, which is still there today. It doesn't seem to have faded over the centuries.
But you think that's pathetic, don't you? You don't really like these pastoral fantasies.
I don't know. I was watching a spider's web about 2 days ago, and there was a beetle stuck in it. And as I watched, a wasp came in and attacked that beetle with such ferocity and drilled away at it for, I don't know, maybe 90 seconds, 2 minutes, just jabbing it, and then flew away again, whether it had sucked the insides out of the beetle or whatever, I don't know. But it did strike me that sentimentalisation of nature that people, I don't know, from Rousseau to Morris, you get, is at odds with the reality of nature, which can be a very cruel and ugly and, using our values, are really disturbing.
It's one person's idea of utopia, but that means it's everybody else's idea of a dystopia. I mean, I certainly would not like to live in that world. So what is a utopia then? Is it just one person's idea of a perfect society, or is it just really a dystopia that you haven't thought hard enough about? If Kevin Rudd got up in Parliament tomorrow and said, "My friends, good news, I've stumbled across a blueprint for a perfect society," I would be terrified. I think everybody would be. It's because there isn't one. It's always going to be one ideas of a perfect society, one person's idea that will not work for everyone else.
I'll tell you, in literature, my idea of a perfect world is, do you remember Enid Blyton's Faraway Tree series, which had the revolving worlds, and you'd have a few bad worlds, and then the good world would come and they'd have unlimited biscuits and fantastic things. That was utopia.
There's a kind of fervour in the way you describe that I find a little disturbing.
Absolutely. Retrograde.
But they were always happy to get back home at the end, weren't they?
Yes, they were. Yes, they were.
There is a blandness in a lot of these utopian visions, as though... I remember being in Vienna years ago and reaching a point where I would just wish that a ute load of Australian yobbos would come burning down the road, chucking a few beer cans out of the windows just to kind of add a little colour or something to the whole place. It just seemed a little too passive and bland.
That's a perfect segue to our dystopias, I think. I think let's look at the biggest one. I mean, it's not the next one in order, but we have to look at 1984, don't we? Which is the granddaddy of dystopias, written in 1948. I mean, is it... why is it that this particular book, of all the ones that we'll talk about through this era, is the one that's hit?
Well, it's interesting you say how we move through to dystopias, and I'd suggest that maybe the only reason that we call them dystopias rather than utopias is that the author actually thought, no, this isn't right. Previously, they're still creating these fabricated societies with complete authoritarian control, and people have to do this and have to do that. But now the author has gone, actually, and I don't think this would be a nice place to live. But 1984, the great thing about 1984 for me is that it's absurd and yet completely realistic. It's very extreme, and yet it's only different to our current world in degrees. You can see the types of propaganda that happen in the media in the book, and I think it's so relevant to us that, and it has continued to be so from the 50s onwards, that's what gives it its power.
And great, I think also it's the way that it uses language or invents language, and once you've read it, you have for the rest of your life the understanding that institutions with names, the names are actually the opposite of what they do. So,
Yes.
So you've got the Minister of Love, with the Australian military, it's called, it's for our defence.
Yes.
We basically attack. Our force is an attack force. And I think it's just, it's so clear about the inherent falseness of a lot of institutions and bureaucrats. And I think it opens you up to be much more analytical. This is where I think they are useful, to understand what's going on. And incidentally, we've left out, of course, he was inspired by Huxley, who was his... I mean, I taught him at school. Yeah, Brave New World, which actually also has, that's not all dark and full of rules. That's very ambivalent.
Well, in fact, Margaret Atwood, who's a woman who likes a bit of dystopia herself, with we'll come to The Handmaid's Tale and Oryx and Crake, but she talks about the difference between the hard dystopia and the soft dystopia, and the hard dystopia is 1984.
Yeah.
The soft dystopia, and I would suggest maybe Fahrenheit 451 fits into that. I'd like to where one has, you have the authority and command of the state, but people cooperate. There is, in fact, in Brave New World, there's genetic manipulation, there is brainwashing, there is soma.
Lots of wonderful drugs.
Lots of drugs. So it's the state still has power, but also we as people have ceded them power. This is kind of a softer dystopia, yeah?
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah.
They're all just exaggerating directions society's already moving in, and they're taking them to their sort of ultimate
Well, I find
conclusions.
1984 to be really compelling. I think that's a world that could exist.
Well, and they all do exist to a certain extent, but there is a limit to that, and the world of 1984, where people are tortured with rats and so on, is hopefully not one that we'll attain in the West, at least.
Waterboard?
Are you kidding?
The waterboard?
Where do you
It
live?
happens. He lives in a pastoral place.
He lives in-
Spiders we live there.
In an idyllic setting, yeah. No, maybe I'll have to backtrack on that a little.
Reproductive bioengineering is another big fear. And there's a whole raft, particularly in recent years, it seems to me, of books that have played specifically on that, whether it's The Children of Men, P.D. James, where the world is everyone's infertile, whether it's Never Let Me Go with Ishiguro, where they actually extract the organs. Children are born specially for the extraction of organs. There are a lot of books which really deal specifically with that now, aren't there?
Yep.
Reproductive failure.
I get the feeling that in the 50s and 60s there was that fear of the atomic age, and you had books like On the Beach by Neville Shute, and that kind of explored that scenario, but it was more light entertainment really, although it did have a serious message, of course. But in the last 20 years, as you say, it's a sort of fear has become more real, and I think it's because we're no longer so concerned about the atomic threat. Now it's global warming and the kind of future of the planet, and that we're starting to actually contemplate that we are in deep trouble and we may be going to lose the whole thing, and that may be starting to come out to emerge in these
Yes.
about sterility.
I mean,
and
that's true, isn't it? The post-apocalyptic fear. I mean, you know, let's look at that.
Well, that's what we're entering now. In fact, I think of it as apoco porn, in a way, because it's such a... There are so many scenarios now, and some of them... There's one started out in Rolling Stone magazine by Jim Kunstler called The Long Emergency, and I think he wrote this 10 years ago. But actually, it is all based on the complete end of suburbia because of the decline of oil. And when he first wrote it, it's brilliantly written. It talks about the days of the 25-mile Caesar salads have come to an end. No one really believed it. It just seemed a scenario. But now, actually, there's not only peak oil, there's peak water, there's peak topsoil, there's peak everything. And I think that we're going to... In fact, on websites in particular, you're getting a lot more dystopic, a kind of futurist, end-of-the-world warnings, which, again, kind of grim, but unfortunately rather believable in some cases.
It's getting serious. Yeah.
It is getting serious, yeah.
Why do we read these books? I mean, let's take an example, what I would regard as the best of the post-apocalyptic batch recently, which is Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which is a book of just such beauty as well. Now, you can read it for the beauty, but let's face it, it's grim. It's really, really
And
grim.
it's exciting because it's just, you think, my God.
What's wrong with us that we want to read it?
Well, because it's compelling. I think it's really smart that he doesn't actually explain the nature of the apocalypse or the event, and that doesn't really matter. Because it's also a very intimate relationship between father and son, and I know that the woman left the scene a bit earlier, but I think because there's an element of possibility in it. I mean, if you don't accept that it's something like that is possible, hopefully not for the whole world, but certainly, like Chernobyl was just in one area, but there could be a Holocaust event of some sort.
A lot of this dystopian stuff, I find, at its core is really optimistic, because what you have with dystopias is everything stripped away. You don't have authority. It doesn't matter what your social status is, your economic status. You don't have the law in a lot of cases. What's the nature of humanity then? What are we when all that is stripped away?
And that was what The Road was about.
What I love, and I have problems with it in other ways, but what I love about it is that...
To sell out.
The ending
is that the little...
sellout.
Well, the ending is controversial, but what I do love, though, is the optimistic view of human nature in that the boy who hasn't been brought up in civilization, that should be sort of, by some ideas about human nature, should be pretty much a beast going out for whatever he can get, despite his father's influence. He is generous and he has an empathetic kind of impulse.
Carries
and it's
the
his
flame.
father. Well, his father's always saying that to him, but regardless of that, his father's the one who's telling him to be less generous, to not reach out to other people, and is kind of educating him to turn away from other humans. But his impulse, the human impulse of that boy, is for generosity. And that is, it may not be quite believable, but it's certainly not, to me, a grim
I question whether
It's an
that book is
optimistic
actually
heart.
a dystopia at all, though. I mean, a few of these books are probably the children of men as
The
well.
world is burnt to a cinder. If everyone dies and there's cannibals, that doesn't sound good to me.
It's a disaster story. A dystopia, for me, has at least a significant group of people in it who think, all right, this is it. This is our society now, and we're going to go on like this. This is our model. Whereas the Children of Men, for example, P.D. James, I read, said that the interest there was in how people behaved when they had no future. So it's not really about what kind of society can we create and what will its rules be. It's really about how people respond to some kind of cataclysmic event.
And so you're saying it is still a human story in the way
it's
that...
a human story, but it's an event story rather than a social, political, economic system story.
What about, you wrote basically a post-apocalyptic or, invasion book, and you gave the salvation of Earth to a group of young people.
But no, it's not a salvation
Isn't that your
ending.
flame? Aren't you being Cormac McCarthy?
Not at all. Mine's not a sellout ending. It's not a salvation ending at all. I resent that. It's an ending which is a compromise where it says that there's no winners in a war. There are some people who, get a few concessions and some people who make a few compromises, and you end up with a kind of messy outcome which no one's ever going to be very happy with. That's the ending of my series. But I did... I named it Tomorrow When the War Began because I wanted people to believe that this was history, even though it hadn't quite happened yet. So that kind of... A lot of people thought I just didn't know my grammar very well and asked me, didn't you mix the tenses up when you wrote that title? But, the idea is that this is imminent, it will happen, and I'm writing about it with such certainty because I know it will happen at any moment. I remember a teacher in Wagga or somewhere saying that one of his Year 9 students was very disturbed by the book and couldn't sleep at nights. And before he could say any more, I said, well, I hope you didn't give her any comfort or sort of tell her that she shouldn't feel that way. And he looked a bit taken aback and said, well, I did. And I said, well, I think you're wrong because this stuff could easily happen. So
it was meant as a warning.
You shouldn't give people false comfort. Yeah, it was one of my purposes in writing it.
You're a cheery guy, aren't you?
What about you? You've got the world taken over by corporations, Max.
Yeah, but
that's a cheerier future.
How?
Well, I think there's an interesting thing you can do with dystopias where you find something that sits on the fence between funny and terrifying. Because all of these concepts where you take one aspect of society and you stretch it out to the extreme, there's a slight ridiculous element to that. So with my novel, what I wanted to do was to say, to have the reader not quite sure whether they should be laughing or not at particular passages. So the world taken over by corporations, I think is I think it's quite plausible. I see it coming, but I don't.
It already has been.
Well, that's right. It's not a huge jump from where we are.
In the end, where is the utopia? Where is the modern version of the utopia? Why are we only writing dystopias?
Well, I don't think there ever was a utopia. I don't think they were all dystopias that we didn't look at hard
People were
enough.
more optimistic a few... Although, I don't know, when we were talking before, I was thinking William Blake was the ultimate kind of... when it comes to statements about how industrialisation is corrupting the world, no one said it more eloquently, more beautifully, more poetically than Blake. So this kind of pessimism and despair has been being voiced now for a long time. But I think there were more utopian novels being written right through the 19th century.
Yeah, and there's a very famous one called
now.
Ecotopia by Cohenberg, who wrote one and sold an incredible number of copies. But I think the answer to that question is that a lot of people are reacting to the corporate world in a very negative way and understanding about the disappearances of things that keep us going, the end of an energy system that we're pretty, fat and bloated by. And so there is an awful lot of rather sentimental dreaming by people, again, of my generation of culture, and I guess I'm party to it, of, wow, collaboration's going to come back. Instead of all ferociously competing, maybe we're all going to help each other succeed. And in the Blue Mountains, where I live, there's all these people growing vegetable gardens, and there is a kind of dreamy, rather idealised feeling that, wait a minute, maybe the end of the money-grubbing, corporate, competitive, militarised world, maybe it's not all bad. Maybe we can have a little bit of
wishful thinking.
creativity and innovation again.
Reality check from you, Emily.
Yeah.
What do you say?
Well, that's interesting. Cahalan Army, which was a book by the English writer Sarah Hall, which came out just over a year ago, is fantastic in playing this out because it is a very near future, quite believable England where excessive flooding has caused people to be sort of crowded into the cities. There's a fuel crisis. There's oil wars going on. So people are under the control of an nameless authority.
It's got the same elements as pretty much every...
Indeed.
You know,
one of the ways that they're going to control
Yeah.
population is by forcibly inserting contraceptive devices into all women. The particular narrator of the story decides she's had enough of this world and she takes off for a dreamed utopia that she's heard about as a child from the generation before, this all-women commune of Cahalan up in the mountains, and she thinks that will be her utopia if she can escape. And of course when she gets there, it's not at all. It's not at all because it's a human society and humans stuff things up and people get power hungry. And of course there's other interesting questions come into this of what's the difference between freedom fighters and revolutionaries and terrorists, because these women are not just knitting up there. They're forming a revolutionary army.
I mean, they're stalking and they're killing.
Indeed, and so it's not this utopia of people with all the 60s and 70s ideas about, it starts as a commune, but it develops into something else, because how long can you sit there and not be part of the world? And there's great questions about, is it okay to just take yourself out of it all and I'm right and not worry about what's happening on down there? Or is there a point? And does that make them less moral that they start fighting and taking up arms?
These books, they're kind of they want to turn us all into terrorists, I think, most of them. And they want, in a very healthy way, and they're saying to us, take arms against the sea of troubles, get out there and do something about this stuff. Do a Peter Finch and yell, I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take it anymore. And if we do heed those messages and continue to assert ourselves, then I think the future should be good. But there are...
Do you believe that? Do you believe in a good future?
I think so. I've been very troubled by a panel discussion I heard a few years ago on ABC Radio about the Barrier Reef. And they had, I think, 3 scientists speaking very thoughtfully in turn about their research and showing that there were very serious threats to the Barrier Reef. And then the next speaker was Doug Anthony, the politician. And he jumped up and said, well, I'm an optimist. And everyone applauded warmly, and I thought, for Christ's sake, that is the most stupid and unhelpful statement that anyone could possibly make. The thing that I objected to with Doug Anthony's statement was that he was just ignoring everything that had been said and just making this kind of shallow, blind, meaningless statement. If we're going to be optimistic, there has to be some solid basis for our optimism, and if there isn't a solid basis, we have to create a solid basis.
So if the old fear of up to the 1900s was of social disorder and chaos, and the fear of the 20th century really was of repression and totalitarianism, what is the fear that we will see, do you think, and that there will be books written about? Is it going to be about the environmental collapse?
Well, it's going to be about the environmental collapse.
Yes,
and also I think it's going to be about corporations, and it's going to be really about disengagement, which is where dystopian fiction can kind of come in. And again, I see it as a positive impulse writing it, not an optimistic impulse, but a sense of having characters and in turn the reader pay attention to this stuff, whether it is global warming or corporations slowly seeping their way into our lives more and more. It's about having people who notice what's happening.
So it's the reverse of 1984. Don't turn off those speakers.
Yes, there's a real fear of people
engage.
disengaging from what's happening, and that's how these things... I mean, this is how global warming has happened in increments, in a sense, of no one paying attention and doing anything about it, and it's how corporations gain control in increments.
A final question, which is reading this, thinking about these issues of where we've been, what we've been frightened of, where we're going. Do you think it makes, given the purpose of so many is warning and alert, it makes us more responsible citizens, or does it just make us paranoid lunatics? I mean, us, all of us.
There's certainly an element of playing on fear. That's what makes it interesting. And I think it's interesting to think about whether we live in a dystopia or a utopia today. I kind of think that any generation past would be a bit shocked at the things that happen, the morals, the values, what we consider to be right in society today. And perhaps what we would consider to be a dystopia in 50 years' time will be perfectly normal to those people who live in it and considered a lot better than the world we have today. So certainly it's all a matter of perspective.
So what do you think, John? Degree of paranoia is necessary?
Well, one of the things that characterises a lot of these books is the idea that we're entitled to happiness and we should search for it, and it's out there somewhere, and we will find it. That's the kind of promise, the implicit promise in a lot of them. And I think we should let that go. I mean, even the American Constitution only offers the right to pursue happiness, I think, is that the wording? Yeah. And we should settle for that at least, I think, and not kid ourselves that there is happiness to be found out there. We should be a little less, make fewer demands perhaps on the world than that.
Because as they said in Brave New World, everybody is happy now.
Yeah. I think engagement is the way I'd put it. I think it's important to engage the future. I think that a lot of this discussion generally is about the present and the past, but this other sort of time zone exists, and the future sort of does leave its clues, its footprints on the sand in some way. And I think that if we can just, it's very hard for humans to sort of have beam before sight upwards, but that's where you can find the clues, and there are both positive and negative ones. And I think that's it's quite exhilarating that the feeling that you can get a handle on what's going on, and that enlarges your capacity to think and maybe help participate to solve these problems.
And rise above your fears.
Well, I think so.
Emily, was Hunter S. Thompson right? If you're not paranoid, you're crazy? Or do we need to listen
between
to these
awareness
warnings?
and paranoia. I mean, crime novels make me paranoid that every car behind me is... so, I mean, how realistic are these things? You know, there's a certain sense of awareness, but most people reading these books know that the purpose of them is to sort of have the thought experiment, taking it to the extreme. So I don't think it's really going to make you terribly paranoid.
Those books that we've been talking about tonight will be on our website. I know there are so many. We didn't get to William Gibson, we didn't get to Ian Banks. There are so many, but our time is up. A big thank you to our guests tonight, to Richard Neville, to Emily Maguire, to John Marsden and to Max Barry. Won't you thank them with me? Thank you for your company, and I hope you'll join us again next month for our regular First Tuesday Book Club. Until then, don't scare yourself. Very happy reading. Good night.
For more ABC TV vodcasts, go to the website abc.net.au/TV/video.